We going to China for the qualifiers. And after that, it's London. Can't nobody beat me.
Mr. Barry Jenkins, sir, welcome to the Awards Tour podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on this Wednesday.
Yeah,
Wednesday.
on this Wednesday. Listen, I will go ahead and say, waking up to some fresh shortlist stuff for Mufasa, which is great.
hmm hmm
But we're here to talk about The Fire Inside, which I love this because I remember when it was called T-Rex, and
hmm
you were literally like, this is before the Oscars, but like after it had premiered at Telluride, they said you were going to do this story through Universal. So talk about, getting being tapped to write the script and then how you sort of stuck with it through its many iterations till it eventually found Rachel directing it.
Yeah, it was I saw the documentary for this. I want to say it was before Moonlight even premiered at Telluride. Alicia Holmes, who was working with Mike DeLuca and a gentleman named Eric Byers at Universal, just really loved the story of Claressa Shields. And I had never heard of Claressa before I saw the doc for T-Rex, but the moment I watched it, I was like, yeah, I would love to be a part of this. And yet, even at that moment, back then, I was like, but I can't direct it. I think you need someone else to direct this, but I would love to be the writer of it. I feel like there's something I could bring to it as the writer.
Being just the writer in it,
hmm
most of your work you've written for yourself as Barry Jenkins director. Was
hmm
there
hmm
anything different about the adaptation process or the final script when it was getting ready to be a shooting script that you
hmm
did differently, knowing there'd be a different vision behind how to execute it?
There was when I'm writing something that I know I'm going to end up directing, I take a lot of liberties with the language on the page. I find myself I'm communicating my vision to anyone who reads the script because ultimately, when you get to production, the production designer needs to be able to read the script and really into it, what the scene wants to look and feel like, the cinematographer, the sounds people, even. So, but when I'm writing for someone else, that's their job, and I'm trying to be very respectful of that. So I did change in some ways the way I went about writing the script. But then when Rachel came on, we began this new process of rewriting the script, sort of in Rachel's image. And so that part of the process did happen, but it couldn't happen initially because I had to be very respectful. This is going to ultimately become someone else's vision.
One of the things I also really love about this is when I spoke to Rachel and, when she was first doing it, it was still Flint strong. That's
hmm
before it became The Fire Inside. And one of the things that she really talked about is you sort of like convincing her a little bit, not convincing her, like she knew she wanted
hmm
to direct, but having you sort of be a part of the process definitely gave her something where it was a lot less, I think she said intimidating, because it was like what you always do, which is work with friends.
Yeah, yeah. It's, working with friends, but also working on material you have a personal connection to, I think is the key. I think that doing anything, without a personal sort of like interest or a personal sort of like avenue, like into either the characters or the story, it just doesn't work for me. And I think maybe that was a process that Rachel went through as well. But once she was like locked in, she was locked in. And for me, it was just about really figuring out, okay, how can I help you? Like where can I help you access some of these things?
One of the things I really love about this story is on its face, you could say, it is come from, maybe some people would say a place where dreams like this don't come true and then live
hmm
those dreams. And one of the things I think is interesting about you as a writer is I can see aspects of Barry Jenkins, the screenwriter that wrote Fire Inside in Moonlight and in
hmm
all of the sort of things that you did. But what was the architect of Fire Inside? What were those themes that you were most excited to make sure were reverberating throughout the screenplay as this girl goes on this journey to not only reach the Olympics and reach a level of success, but also reach an acceptance with herself?
Yeah, I just loved, and I realized I've been talking about Mufasa all day, this idea of people going on this journey to self-actualize themselves, and doing that through this sort of like collective, like stimulus, connective energy of either the community they belong to or the community they create, like building a found family in the case of Mufasa. I think in the case of this film, Clarissa is very, very much sort of one with her community. You know, when you talk to the actual Claressa Shields, she's very proud of Flint and feels deeply connected there. And yet she has to go on this journey to sort of like realize herself with the help of this gentleman, Jason Crutchfield. You know, the first script I ever wrote, because I'm a former athlete, the first script I ever wrote was a high school football movie. It was the first feature screenplay I ever wrote. And it was sort of about my time in Miami playing football, but I wrote it almost as a response to the feature film at the television show, A Friday Night Lights, only because I remember thinking, you know, most of the players who end up in the NFL, or most of the players who we know of as famous football players, they don't come from this environment, which is like small town Texas. They come from places where I'm from, you know, but we don't ever see their stories told. And I was thinking of an athlete like Claressa Shields or Michael O'Hare, who was dramatized in The Blind Side. And that movie was watched by so many people. It was very successful, and it's a story worth telling. But most of the athletes who make it to the places that Michael O'Hare did, they make it through the sort of collective, sort of like nurturing, the collective sort of like caretaking of people within their community, but we don't see those stories told. And I love that. Here's Jason Crutchfield, this man who installs like you know, does wiring on television poles and cable poles. You know, he's living this very hard scrabble life. It's like, you know, four of them, you know, in a two-bedroom house, and he's got this van, and he's picking up. This is what he actually does with his life. He's picking up kids, taking them to the gym. He's making sure they have something to eat after school, and he's giving them the structure. There are people like him all over the country. These are the people that I grew up with as an athlete, and so many kids I grew up alongside who were more talented than me, that are now in the NFL and give back to the community. They were sort of supported by people like Jason Crutchfield, and yet I hadn't seen stories like that told. And here's Jason and Claressa, and they legitimately go on the world stage and represent all of us in this country. But their stories, you know, someone from the same working class, almost working poor background, giving everything he has to give Claressa the structure she needs so she can then go on to action. I just hadn't seen that story, or it's not told as often as this other story, like the story of Michael O'Hare. So I thought it was a really beautiful thing because I'd seen it in my actual life. And as they say, if you're not seeing something that you think is worth seeing, you have to go out and create it. And I saw this as a wonderful opportunity to go out and create that, to relay that depiction of these things that are happening every day.
You know, it's so interesting too. Like, again, I don't want to bring it back to Mufasa, but I think
Mm-hmm.
because I was thinking of Hamilton, I'm thinking of Lynn, and
Mm-hmm.
that's like how Hamilton did it. Like there was the hurricane, he wrote those bars, and they were like, we need to go send this boy to college. And then for
Mm-hmm.
you, this, I know you said that you hadn't seen that before, but really you were living that experience as you were writing it because you had just become the South Miami kid who made good at the
Yeah.
Oscars and like
Yeah.
did everything like that. I'm curious, looking back on that time now, as you were literally being shot out of a cannon in a multi-million-dollar Disney movie, how
Mm-hmm.
do you reconcile those two Barrys, the one that first wrote this with the one that's living this existence right now?
Oh, but you know what? They're the same person.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting when The Lion King is something that, you know, has existed for 30 years, you know, and it's a part of just global culture. You know, I think you'd have to be disingenuous to say that, oh, I'm a person who makes art films. I never liked The Lion King. You know, I never watched The Lion King. That would be very disingenuous, just as disingenuous as saying, oh, I never saw Coming to America. You know, I never watched those kinds of movies. You know, that's craziness. And so in a certain way, I don't think of the person who, as you said, made good, you know, by representing Miami on the largest stage at the Oscars. I don't think of that person as being distinctly different than this person who was making Mufasa the Lion King, because at some point in my life, you know, I was a person who just watched movies like anybody else. And I wasn't worried about what the kind of movie I watched said about me. You know, I wasn't worried about, you know, how that reflected, you know, on me as an artist. And so I think in a certain way, it's coming full circle, maybe you could say, by telling a story like this one, speaking of Mufasa now. And even in Moonlight's the second film, I think Medicine is the movie that really sort of in a certain way brought me into these circles. And I think they're all of a piece.
Yeah, and I just want to add to this one too, because one of the
Hmm.
themes that I loved from The Fire Inside, which is very true, which is when you make good, because we get to follow her through two Olympics in the course
Hmm.
of the screenplay. When you make good, you oftentimes are then immediately put into a box and told what you can do and can't do.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
what got you there was like the audacity of dreaming that you could. Like it was like
Exactly.
you literally had to be the most like forgive he's problematic now. Kanye level of I am going
Hmm.
to get here.
Hmm.
The minute you get here, they keep telling you you can't. And I think
Hmm.
that's another theme that you are also very acute with, and even more so now, maybe, of like how
Hmm.
making good sometimes limits you. And like, what do you think about that as a filmmaker? What do you think about that as you continue on your journey as a filmmaker?
As a filmmaker, I think it's an interesting thing to. It's like someone was saying, "Oh, when you making Mufasa, do you feel intimidated by the legacy?" I think you have to acknowledge, that you're operating in the legacy of certain things, but then you have to do what you do. I think this thing that we're talking about right now, you have to acknowledge that somehow through the success you have or you create or that you receive and achieve, yes, then there's certain sort of like pressures or outside limitations that can come with that, and you have to acknowledge that because as you make decisions, those decisions are going to be judged by people, who know nothing about you, have no relation to you, and so you can't. You have to be blissfully ignorant of those things and just go about making your choices. With someone like Claressa, that choice becomes, in some ways, to use extreme terms, a difference between life and death. You know,
Mhm.
because it's like, oh, you won this gold medal, and so now you theoretically you shouldn't be living at home the way you did. You should have endorsements and all these things. It's like, oh, but I do, and I've got to find a way to make a living. So what do I do? Um, can I just go and get a job like back in groceries? Well, you can, but you shouldn't, because that's not what someone who does this thing does. And I think what I loved about, the documentary in particular, but about working on the fictional dramatization of this based on a true story movie was getting to really explore, the movie is building and building and building. And then the typical sports drama thing happens and you go, okay, nope. And then it's like, now the journey begins, I just love the idea of an audience getting to experience that with someone who we know actually lived this experience, because it's the kind of thing that, we're talking right now about. So when you have a certain success and then you almost kind of become trapped by the things that we associate with that kind of success, but then you have to actually go out and live your life. Claressa actually did that, and I love that in the aftermath of that, we then get to show audiences the reason why some of these athletes behave the way they do in the public after they achieve the success is because this is the they went through that we don't ever think about or care about or acknowledge. And again, it was really fun is not the right word, because I did feel like there was something very vital that we were trying to illuminate. But it was very, I'll say, invigorating to sort of, work with Rachel and Claressa and try to figure out what about this experience can we shed light on.
I definitely, I don't know, man. I just feel like this is what you said. You don't write things that you don't feel connected to. But the more I examine this script, I think some people would wonder why you felt so connected to the boxing Olympian story from the girl from Michigan. But like as I read into it more, it's like, man, this was something you were destined to do in a lot of ways because it has so many parallels to stuff you did.
It does, and it also has parallels to the life I actually lived, before all of these things. Like I said, the first script I ever wrote was a movie about high school football, and it was about, kids from my hood, the same world you see depicted in Moonlight, but it was like these other kids, maybe in some ways the kids who are not so nice to Chiron, but about the struggles they are going through, and the young, not necessarily young, but the Black men who are trying to use everything they can to create fulfillment in both those men's lives, but also fulfillment in those young men's lives as well. And again, if we don't see that sacrifice, because a lot of these men, you know, they are just like the working poor, and yet they are taking, it's almost like they're tithing, because they're not just coaching these kids, you know, especially where I'm from, you know, they are providing structure, they're providing meals, all these different things, man. And their stories just are not told. And like what Michael Jordan said, and I took that personally, you know?
Took that personally. Yeah. Listen, also, I do think it's changed now. One of my favorite tweets, and I know you saw this from a few years ago, was calling how Brian Tyree Henry is one of the most underrated actors of our time.
Yeah.
Like, and I remember this, and it was like 35 million likes or whatever, because it was like everybody absolutely agreed. And I love movies like this and like his career over the past few years that have continued to showcase like he's not just Doughboy. Like he's not just,
Exactly.
you know what I mean? Like this man
I
has
mean,
change upon
like,
range, which you knew.
on Bill Street, he did that work in 2 days, like 2 days, you know? And he came up from Atlanta, making Atlanta. He had to be in hair and makeup for like 4 hours. So short days he worked, because he was still dope boy. So he had to like get more paperwork. He had to get all this stuff put on him, and he still did the work. I think him and Ryan Destiny do such a great job. You know,
Yeah.
Claressa and Jason are like, they're larger than life in my mind, and embodying them is it's not an easy task. And you know, when you write a script, sometimes you're always trying to get what's the simplest scene that's going to communicate everything that's at stake for these two characters. And you know, when he comes home because she's been out with dad and they're arguing about the gold medal, it's just two people going at it, just going at it, and they take the language of that scene and they just make every word feel like it's just this thermonuclear, spiritual, emotional sort of like bomb. And they're just like haymaker, haymaker, haymaker. It was really fun to watch that scene come through, because you have one version of it in your head or on the page, and then the actors bring this whole other level to it.
I mean, that brings me to my last question. I was going to talk about Ryan Destiny, who plays Claressa. And the thing I will say about her, sometimes with certain actors, when they get out on the awards tour and you meet them, you realize how good of an actor they are. Because obviously I was not, and most people were not as familiar with Ryan Destiny outside of, you know, the few things we kind of seen her in. But seeing her in person compared to what she's doing with Claressa, I was like, girl, that is acting. Because like I'm
Exactly.
walking out with the Met Gala over here. Same thing
Exactly.
with like Trevante. She reminded me of what it was like when I met Trevante in person compared
Yeah.
to what you had made him in
Exactly.
the film, which I think is a testament. But I was curious if you talked to Rachel about that casting process as a producer and like how involved were you in that?
I did. I talked to Rachel, and again, that performance is all Ryan and Rachel. But I did talk to Rachel about, because Claressa is physically just like a very imposing figure, and Ryan is not the physical equal of Claressa. But what I said to Rachel was, Moonlight's a great example. It doesn't matter, you know, if she can capture that energy and translate it to the audience. Boom. And what there's this saying, it's not the size of the dog, it's the size of the bite in the dog, or something like that. There's some saying like that. And I
Yeah.
think that applies to Ryan in this performance. And I think Rachel did a really wonderful job throughout the casting process of always sort of holding close to what is the energy this person is pushing. And Ryan just showed at every step that she could. And even right now, as we're talking, I'm just seeing certain scenes, certain facial expressions from Ryan throughout the movie, where sometimes you watch a film and you start to see the person and you compare them to the actual person. And now I'm at a point where I just see Ryan, which is really incredible, because again, Claressa is a very large presence.
I love that. Well, congratulations on both of them. And thank you again for chatting with us.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.